Well, welcome to Dairy Livestream, brought to you by Hordes Dairyman. I'm your host, Corey Geiger, managing editor of Hordes Dairyman. We are broadcasting from the Cheese Cave, our studio in downtown Fort Atkinson at the historic W.D. Horde & Sons Company building, commissioned by our founder, Governor W.D. Horde. We have a thought-provoking session planned for our audience this week, preparing for your farm's future, as we discuss farm finances and future plans. Today, we will welcome back three well-known commentators to Dairy Livestream: Cornell's Andy Novakovic, University of Wisconsin-Madison's Mark Stevenson, and Cornell's Chris Wolf. We're going to go straight to a poll question as a prelude to Andy's initial comments, and Jim Baltz can go ahead and put that on the screen. How might U.S. milk production change the remainder of the year when compared to 2019? Down 0.5%, up 0.5%, up 1.5%, or up 2.5%. So this is just an audience perspective here. So go ahead and answer that question. And Andy will talk a little bit more about that. So go ahead and cut that poll off, Jim, here. And you can see the responses there, Andy. Let's take our plane to 30,000 feet and talk big picture macroeconomics as it relates to the economy and its impact on dairy. So you'll see that half of our audience said 1.5 and 38% said 0.5%, with not much on the tails there. Andy?
Yeah, so thanks, Corey. As a group, what our hope is today is to talk a little bit about the current situation, but really kind of see if we can focus on what might be coming down the road, and are there things you can do to make that trip down that road a little bit less bumpy. That first question on milk production is an important one. I'm going to focus on the general economy and the demand environment, and that's going to intersect very directly with what's happening with milk production, or what I should say, what will happen with milk production. I think we've all learned, and certainly folks like Mark and Chris and I, who have spent quite a bit of time over the years thinking about outlook sorts of stuff, have come to understand really what looks like to a normal person, like pretty small changes in production and consumption can have pretty powerful effects on price. And the key is which one is changing by the larger amount. Is production might be growing 1.5% and doesn't seem like much, but if consumption is only growing by 0.8%, that can have a really powerful downward effect on price. And so it's important to think about those two going together and asking the question, are we going to keep this a little bit in balance, or how hard is that going to be to keep in balance, and so on. So let me start with the sort of the 30,000 foot level of the general economy. I'm going to talk a little bit about food sales in particular, and food service, and then try to bring that down to some general implications. So, I probably could cut this short and just say, oh my goodness, we got all kinds of problems on the economy side, and it's going to be a while before we dig out of it. But let me just share with you some of the numbers and some of the directions. If you look at the typical single measure of whether or not the economy is growing or shrinking or prospering, that variable is called gross domestic product. It kind of represents the grand total of economic activity in the U.S. Quarter one, obviously January, February, March, GDP was actually 5% below 2019. So even before we really got into the whole pandemic scenario, economic growth was slowing, and actually slowing by a fair bit. Quarter two jumped that from -5% to -32% compared to April through May of 2019. When you think about the pieces of that gross domestic product, there's, I think, some interesting insights. One piece of that is, what do we spend on consumption? Things that we buy to consume within a year. Food would certainly be one of those, but socks, clothing, all that kind of stuff would be under the consumption category. That was down roughly comparable to the GDP, -7% quarter one, -34% in the second quarter. Investment expenditures were down slightly more, minus 46% in the second quarter. One of the things we might ask ourselves is, so how is this the same or different from the last time we had a notable downturn, which we call the Great Recession, beginning in 2008 and going into 2009 and not really digging out of that hole until 2010? Well, number one, the downturn in the Great Recession was nowhere near as deep in terms of almost any kind of measure as what we're seeing now. What we have now is very sudden. The Great Recession spread out over more quarters. We haven't played ours out yet, but that wasn't as deep. And the Great Recession was more about investments and less about consumption. During that time period, we had federal programs to rescue so-called troubled assets, and we provided a lot of money to companies so they didn't go bankrupt. And we were worried about households that were upside down on their mortgage. They owed more money than their house was worth. Now we're really looking at something that is more of a consumption-related issue. Yes, investment expenditures are down compared to a year earlier, but if you compare the Great Recession with what's going on now, let's call it the pandemic recession, this is more of a consumption effect. It's not about assets. It's not about being able to have a mortgage that's more than the value of your house. It's more about whether or not you can afford to pay your rent. If you bring that down then to what do people have to spend, this is, I think, sort of an interesting number. The data is called personal disposable income. How much money do I have left over after I pay taxes and a few other things that I can spend sort of at my discretion? In quarter one, that number was up 3%. In quarter two, that number was up 13%. Well, you might go, whoa, wait a minute. How is that I got more money to spend when this pandemic is really hitting? If you take out government benefits, which is Social Security and every other kind of benefit, but certainly also the extra funding that came through the CARES Act and these other things to help people get along, that quarter one statistic is exactly the same, 3%, whether you have government benefits or not. You take away government benefits, and instead of plus 13%, personal disposable income is now minus 4%. So I think this highlights very much how very, very important these government programs to get money into the hands of middle-class, working class people has been. And that has had a tremendously important impact on not having even worse result for consumption-type expenditures. Even though total consumption expenditures are down 10%, it would have been, in quarter two, it would have been even worse. So the economy is in serious decline. Government expenditures have been huge, but there's tension about that because these government expenditures isn't going to Fort Knox and bringing out the gold bars. This is borrowing money from somebody, and it's almost always going to be a foreign government. And well, guess what? China's got a lot of dollars that they like to put and return something. So the current estimate is China has about 3 trillion US dollars sitting in a pile on Mao Zedong's tomb or something, and about 1 trillion of that they lend to the United States of America. If that weren't there, it would be a little bit tough floating the debt that we're floating now. I think also when you look at the question, well, what's it saying? The stock market's going like crazy. Dow Jones, S&P, oh my God, Apple's the biggest company ever. What does that mean? Well, I think what that means is rich people and pension funds are doing okay, but folks that need to actually go to work and bring home a check every couple of weeks are not the ones that are floating the stock market. And this is also a reflection of how the Great Recession is different from the pandemic recession. If we look at the big picture on food purchases, which of course is where our industry lives, obviously the story there is that food away from home has been pretty much devastated. We could look at a lot of the statistics on that, but I won't plow through those. I'll simply say, without question, this has been an important impact. if we look a little bit inside the data, we see that so-called limited service restaurants, the kind where you can drive up to a window and get something and take it home, are doing much better than places where you go in and sit down. And that hasn't really changed since the economy has opened up a bit more. It's also the case that we're moving into the time of the year when we would expect to see increases in food away from home. So it's going to be very important to figure out whether or not people choose to go back to restaurants. And I would point out it's kind of doesn't matter that much if you have a public restriction or if people just don't feel comfortable going out to eat. And honestly, however you might feel about the risk of going out to eat is, that's great for you. But the reality is there are a lot of people, particularly those living in cities, which is where most of the people live, who aren't all that keen on exposing themselves to potentially getting sick by going to restaurants. So just our personal choices are continuing to slow growth in that category. I think the implications of all of this is that there are public responses, but also private responses that are going to drive what the next half of, or the end of 2020 does. And I think they suggest we're probably going to continue to have negative or at least slow growth in the economy. We're probably going to continue to have negative investment, which is troubling long-term, maybe not so troubling short-term. We also are observing that in 2020, we had very serious declines in both exports and imports. Both of them came into the year minus 10% on exports, minus 15% on imports. Second quarter, minus 63% on exports, minus 54% on imports. So trade is shrinking. And in general, we're not talking about dairy. And so having that become a growth engine for us doesn't seem super probable. And lastly, I think the implication is we're going to continue to see rather weak income growth. So this really puts a lot more of the onus on how expansive the economy might be, or how much money we're going to have to spend on paying our rent and buying our groceries. Puts much more onus on federal spending. And it's very clear that federal spending benefits to people, stimulus, if you want to call it that, has really made the most impact on keeping spending from being even worse than it is. Obviously, there's a lot of debate about whether we should continue this. There's a lot of paralysis in government about doing anything, which I'm not interested in talking about who's right and who's wrong, but the reality is if we do nothing, it gets worse. The stimulus spending has been incredibly important in maintaining some lift for household incomes currently. The other thing I'll say in terms of implications is we have to also keep in mind that the pandemic economy has added a lot of cost to the value chain, which is unproductive. Mark and I were joking the other day, we should have bought stock in whoever it is that makes plexiglass, because my goodness, I don't know how many football fields of plexiglass people are buying and then installing and trying to make it look nice. Surely that's not free. How much money everybody's spending on personal protection equipment and scheduling staff so that you can minimize interactions and kind of maintain a healthier environment in the workplace. And all of that stuff is non-productive cost that is adding to expenditures without creating more wealth, more food, more whatever. Again, I'm not eager at all to get into election stuff, but the reality is the election will make a difference. And what I would say is the results for the United States Senate are just as important as the results for the White House. It's pretty clear Republicans are not going to win the House, and so the ability for a Republican Senate and a Republican president in 2021 to get things done isn't going to be any better than it is today, and maybe worse. There's a scenario where Democrats could win the whole deal, and they could, that would at least give them some better chance of coming up with something, although it might be something you didn't care for, or it might be something you love. But the reality is the election and what happens in 2021 are tied, and it's all particularly important because government's role has been so important in providing any kind of lift to the economy. And with that, Corey, I'll turn it over to, I guess, Mark.
All right. Before we invite Mark's comments, we're going to go straight to another poll question. Jim, go ahead. What percent of Wisconsin dairy farmers said they would be milking cows in 2025? Your options are 53%, 63%, 73%, or 83%. Go ahead and answer that poll question. This comes from a very elaborate survey with a lot of response. And so go ahead and answer that. And when the poll question gets completed, Mark will talk about that. The survey was responded by over 2,800 Wisconsin dairy farmers. So let's go ahead and cut the polls off there. And Mark, you can go straight ahead and tell us the correct answer to that and what else you learned from that survey that you were very involved with. Welcome to the program, Mark.
Well, thank you. The correct answer was 83%. So clearly farm loss, will continue, and most people were up in that higher end of the responses there, but I think they were a little grumpier about, the likelihood that farms were going to be sticking around than what the actual revealed number was from farms that were asked. I should point out that this dairy producer survey was a 4-organization partnership to get the survey done. 10 years ago, in 2010, there was a similar kind of survey that was done, and this was to provide a snapshot, if you will, in time about where is the dairy industry in Wisconsin, and they asked pertinent questions of that time for the next 10 years or so, 5 years that they were actually asking ahead for. But 10 years later, we were sitting there thinking that maybe it's time that we took another snapshot and saw where farmers were, particularly since we've had higher than average farm loss over the last 3 or 4 years, and that we've had quite a bit in the way of changes that have happened on dairy farms during the last almost 6 years here, with relatively low prices and now going into the pandemic economy. However, I will point out that the pandemic economy wasn't a thing at the time we were talking about this. The 4 organizations were Wisconsin Dairy Farmers, which is the folks that steer the 10 cents of the checkoff dollars here in Wisconsin, interested in what dairy farmers were thinking about the future. It was also our Department of Ag Trade and Consumer Protection, which is the State Department of Agriculture in Wisconsin. It was the University of Wisconsin, represented by me, and it was the state's National Ag Statistics Service that actually administered and tabulated the survey. So we had a great response from this thing. This was conceived of, the questions put together at the end of 2019, and it was mailed out and administered in early January of 2020. And we were asking for those surveys to be returned by March. And, again, as I said, we didn't know anything about the pandemic at that point in time, but when we did know about the pandemic, we had some concerns that maybe we wouldn't have good response rate. But it turns out that of the 7,000 some surveys that were mailed out, we got about 2,800 returned for a response rate of 41%. Anybody that does surveys would tell you that's a very good and a very high return rate on that. There are lots of ways that we can tabulate questions, and we were interested in responses, some of them by where the farms were located in the state, and some of them by the relative size of the farms. And the farm size categories we dealt with were less than 50 cows, 50 to under 100 cows, 100 to under 200 cows, 200 to under 300, 300 to under 700, and 700 and greater. And we had a pretty good dispersion of farms in all those categories. The largest number of respondents came in the 50 to 99 cow response rate, and the smallest number was the 700 and above, but we still had 123 of those farms here. So it was a pretty good sample of folks, and it wasn't terribly biased when we take a look at it. I'm not going to go through all of the different kinds of responses that we saw. We asked some very specific questions about things like heifer raising and the type of semen, sex semen or bull semen, that was being used on farms. Those are sort of questions of the day and time. But one of the things that I thought was maybe interesting I would share is to just help categorize the dairy farms by looking at the type of production management systems that the farms were employing. And there were three options here. One of them was conventional dairy, another was organic, and the third was managed intensive grazing. And perhaps not a surprise to folks, but there was clearly a size response in this question. Fully 28% of farms were organic if they were in that 100 cows and less category. If you were talking about the other farm sizes, it was relatively small percentage. If you were looking at the intensive grazing, perhaps somewhat collinear with organic farms, you were looking at 34% of the respondents in that less than 100 cow size group. And by the time you look up at the 700 cows and above, it was not quite, but almost 100% that was conventional milk production. So different kinds of farming system. We ask questions because we hear a lot about labor shortages being a real issue for dairy farms, and not just in Wisconsin, but around the country. Maybe some of these responses are applicable in other regions as well. But when we asked about will you need additional labor in the next 2 years, there was a surprisingly large percentage of farms that responded, yes, I will. Even in the less than 50 cow category, 10% of farms said, I will need additional labor in the next 2 years. And by the time you got up to the 700 or above, 55% of farms. We also asked some questions about the source of farm labor. It's getting more difficult and to find people. And one of the questions that was asked was about whether or not you would be willing to hire a person who's been incarcerated but released. And there was a surprisingly large percentage of folks that said, yes, we would. Again, a little bit of a size impact with the larger farms being more willing to hire a person who had been incarcerated. We asked two sets of questions also about investment in dairy farm facilities. And we ask a question looking back, as in how much have you invested in facilities in the past 5 years? And one of the facilities was dairy housing. Another was feed handling and storage systems. One was milking systems, and the other was manure handling. The largest expenditures by far were on dairy cattle housing. I'm not sure I would have guessed that. I would have thought perhaps manure handling might have been up there in the range too. That did come in number 2, but well short of dairy housing. So the expenditures, were sort of telling us that dairy facilities, housing facilities were important in the past 5 years. We also ask about the next few years, looking forward the next 5 years. What do you anticipate spending money on? And here again, the ranking was very similar. Dairy housing was the largest, but in all of these categories, the anticipated expenditure on facilities was less than it was for the last 5 years. So people don't expect to be spending as much money in the next 5 years as they did the last 5 years. I think that tells us a little bit about maybe what's happened to balance sheets over time and their willingness to extend themselves quite so far. And maybe Chris can talk about that a little bit more later on. One of the important questions that we wanted to look at was whether or not the farm anticipated being in farming in the next 5 years. As we mentioned, about 83% of the total group said yes, they had planned to, but that varied from as little as 77% for the 50 cows or less, and it increased in hierarchy up to the 700 plus cow farms, where 99% of the farms indicated that they expected to still be in business. So again, a size category, which is not any different. And interesting to me, when I looked at the response rate there that said 73 or 83% of farms anticipated still being in business, this is roughly the annual attrition rate that we have seen, not in the last couple of years when it's been higher, but in historic reference levels. So people were, I think, answering this question from a fairly honest point of view. They weren't being overly pessimistic about it. Not a great deal of enthusiasm for farm expansion, anticipating more cows being milked, but in fact, more cropland acres were anticipated than adding cows to the farm. So people are looking for more land base than they are looking for cows over the next 5 years. And then finally, maybe the thing I would just end up with is to look at some of the perceived challenges in the dairy industry. When we asked about a whole suite of things, what's causing problems to farm, there were some differences according to the size of operations. But for most of the farms, extreme weather conditions were the number one response. So that was the worst thing that most farms were managing or challenged with. And that could be a response to thinking about 2019, where we had a very wet year, relatively poor feed harvest last year. And it might have been a sign of the times, but managing day-to-day expenses came into that, and inability to find labor were also high priorities. And interestingly, for the 700 cows or above, the very biggest category of challenges, primary challenges, was regulations on farms. So larger farms are feeling that regulations is a much bigger deal for them. We also saw that when asking questions about disruptors over the next 5 years, the largest response here was balancing milk supply and demand. So Andy, I think that builds quite a bit off of what you were just talking about, that the kind of flip that we see between not enough milk, too much milk, is such a hairline for the dairy industry, and it causes big price swings, that this is anticipated by all farm sizes to be one of the biggest disruptors in the next 5 years. So with that, I think I'm going to stop, and I would look forward to hearing what Chris is going to tell us a little bit about the financial circumstances of farms.
Well, thank you, Mark. One of our questions came in, and I have the survey up here right now. It's a 24-page survey, and one of the questions was, what was the average herd size? And I didn't see that in the survey, and maybe you have that data and can find it while Chris is speaking. I did extrapolate a rough number here by taking the number of herds in each category and the high point of the herd size until he got the last category. Came up with roughly about 200 cows, but again, that's some back of the envelope math there. So if you have that number, there's some audience members interested in it. And with that, we'll turn back to, we've had a couple dairy live stream programs recently about finances. And a month ago, New York dairyman John Mueller of Willow Bend Farm shared his perspective that he zeroes in on farm budgets in evaluating financial benchmarks to limit the operation's susceptibility to risk. In quoting John, our philosophy has always been, if you have a strong balance sheet, that's your risk management, he stated. You have to have a budget, and with help benchmarking, you will know where you should be in comparison to the competition. So we're going to go with another poll question here, leading up to Chris. What factor more often leads to improved profitability when looking at the Cornell dairy set? And we're looking specifically at dairy farms, and dairy farms predominantly in the Northeast who would participate in that. So minimizing debt, labor productivity, risk management, or asset productivity? So go ahead and answer that. And again, this is most often leads to improved profitability, and we're going to hear Chris's take in a moment here. So we're getting quite a bit of response. Labor productivity is not faring well in the poll here. I'll give you a hint on that. And so let's go ahead and cut this off. And welcome back to Dairy Livestream. Chris, tell us the correct answer.
Well, thanks, Corey. Yeah, the correct answer is asset productivity. But I think that all four of those can be important, and depending on the situation on your farm, it can certainly be one that you might want to focus on more than the other ones. Traditionally, labor cost is highly correlated with profitability. In the data that we look at across farms, more so than feed cost, but neither one of those is accounting for quality. So, $6 work per hundredweight of feed on different farms can be different depending on quality. But I think, dairy farmers are pretty good about honing in on the nutrition, and something that constantly has to be monitored. Managing people, a little bit more difficult, but really what you see consistently in the data is if you're using your assets to generate sales efficiently, your farm business assets to generate sales, that's going to be highly correlated, obviously, with profit. So let me talk just a little bit more about that and benchmarking profitability, because actually Mark Stevenson and I recently finished a research project that's coming out that looks specifically at benchmarking dairy farm profitability. And here I'm thinking about profitability measured by rate of return on assets. So that would be operating profit margin divided by the assets invested in the farm business. And using a ratio like that helps you to be able to compare across farms and over time. We could think about just net farm income, and that certainly is dollars of profit. But what's a good net farm income on a herd with 100 cows is an entirely different number than what's a good net farm income with 1,500 cows. So if we do rate of return on assets, we standardize that a bit and we can make a comparison. So, and then one way to break rate of return on assets down is to break it down into operating profit margin, which is operating profit divided by sales, so dollars of profit per dollar of sales, and then asset turnover, which is the dollars of sales per dollars of assets. And so what that gets us is we break profitability down into earns times turns. Okay, so operating profit margin is earns. If your operating profit margin is too low, you think, then that would indicate you might want to look at cost control and thinking about whether your cost of production is too high. If your asset turnover, which you want both of these to be high, if your asset turnover is low relative to your peers, then you need to think about why you're not generating enough sales per dollar of assets that you have invested there. And that might indicate that you just are over-invested in assets, or you have unproductive, or what some people might call dead assets. And maybe you need to have less invested, or at least you've got to generate more dollars of sales per dollars invested. And Mark and I, looking at multiple states' data over 17-year period, so this would have been over 8,000 farm observations over 17 years. What we found is, first of all, it's difficult to stay in that top quartile. There's lots of variation across farms and over time, as you might expect. And even the top farms weren't always in the top quartile, right? Things happen. Herd health issues happen, human resource management issues. So, obviously it's a constant struggle. You want to stay in the highest quartile you can, but there's a lot of variation. And because there's a lot of variation, when you're benchmarking specifically profitability, you really need 3 to 5 years of data to get a good idea where you rank relative to your peers. Any one year might be an outlier because things happen because of weather events or other things like that, production or human resource management issues. So when you're benchmarking profitability, if you have 3 to 5 years to judge where you are relative to your peers, you're going to have a better idea where you're at, and that's going to lead, I think, to better decision making. And another thing that really jumped out was that asset turnover ratio was a bigger driver of differences in profitability than was the operating profit margin. And I think that partly reflects the fact that, this being a perfectly competitive type business, that there's a lot of focus, right, on cost control, as there should be. So this doesn't mean that cost control isn't important, but that efficiently using your assets to generate sales was a bigger driver. There was less kind of variation in driving it on the operating profit margin than there was on asset turnover. Doesn't mean that they're not both important. And of course, also keeping in mind when you're making comparisons of benchmarks like this, that you want to compare to similar type farms. And also that there's one nice thing about the dairy industry is there's lots of different ways to do things, depending on where you're located, what type of farm you have, what your resources are, what your personal goals are. But it's certainly something to take a look at.
Yeah, Chris, I might just throw out that one of the things we often look at in data like this, in particular when you're looking at asset intensity and things, or profitability measures, is whether or not farms are renters. Do you own your acreage or are you renting them? And same thing for facilities, because that's a lot of asset on many of our balance sheets.
That's a really good point, Mark. And if you are in order to make things comparable, if you are leasing the machinery, there's ways to put that on the balance sheet so that you got apples to apples. But it's a really good point about the land rental. And land brings a whole other set of factors in here, right? You want to have land available so that you got a place to spread manure. Over time, historically, U.S. farmland is a really good investment, right? 5 or 6% increase in asset value generally over the long term, and it's a good part of the portfolio. On the other hand, when we have commodity prices where we've had in the last couple of years, you're better off buying your feed in some cases, especially concentrates, than you are growing them. So it's a complicated set of decisions. It's a good point.
So one of the early questions we got here, and I'll take this one right away, and I'll make it simple. The survey that Mark Stevenson was talking about, how do we find the results? So I think the simplest thing, instead of giving a long URL, if you went to Google and typed in the following on a Google search, DATCP, that's Department of Agriculture, Trade and Consumer Protection, but just use those letters, DATCP 2020 Dairy Producer Survey Results, and it will ping right to the top. I'll repeat that one more time. DATCP 2020 Dairy Producer Survey Results, and you'll get the PDF there of the 24-page results that Mark was talking about. Mark, I didn't find an average herd size. They broke it out more by categories. Was that what your interpretation was there?
Yeah, you're right in the ballpark. And I think that the thing that tells you is that we got pretty good representation across herd sizes, but I don't have the number right in front of me, so I can't tell you. I'm sorry, but you're in the ballpark with your midpoints on the herd sizes.
Yep, Mark, that 200 cow number is a little below the national average. Where does that fall in for the Wisconsin average?
Pretty close. Yeah, we're a little below average on herd size numbers by states as well.
Andy, a question for you, big picture here. How much can the government borrow before the U.S. has a cash flow problem to pay money and interest back?
Yeah, well, that is a gigantic question. Maybe we should do this as a one of your poll questions, but when was the last time the United States government had a budget surplus? Well, actually, the last time was 1 year when Bill Clinton was president, which, oh, by the way, was a little while ago. When was the last time we had more than 1 year in a row of budget surpluses? Okay, you can think real hard on that. Dwight David Eisenhower was the president of the United States when that happened. And for all the Democrats and Republicans that have been in there in between, we have been spending money more than we've been bringing it in as a general rule. to the point now where there are a lot of serious economists who are kind of going, does it make any difference really? Who cares? Whereas a lot of us are like, wow, that just doesn't sound right. That's got to be a problem. Some of you have noticed that the Federal Reserve, which is generally not really afflicted with political decisions and just as people trying to do the best they can to manage this money markets, have said, you know what, we're going to focus on employment. We're going to just not worry about inflation. And inflation is so low that they're basically saying they don't really think they're going to overheat the economy by having pretty expansionary fiscal policy and monetary policy. In other words, spending money we don't have and making money through monetary policy. I think personally that at some point those chickens come home to roost, and we can't ignore this forever. But as Steve Kyle said, when he was talking about this, at this particular moment in time, I think an expansionary monetary policy and fiscal policy makes sense. The trick is, when things start to get better, are we going to behave ourselves and start paying off some of that debt, or are we going to just continue to spend?
Andy, I think a couple of numbers that really strike me when I look at them. Our U.S. annual budget, I mean, the budget of the government, is about $4 trillion a year, right? Something like that. Our total U.S. debt, I think, is something like $23-24 trillion. These bills that we've been passing, some of these emergency spending bills, well, CARES was what, $2.2 trillion? The Democrats and Republicans have had a hard time coming to grips with what they want to spend on another package, but it's somewhere between $1 and $3 trillion. So you're talking about looking at maybe double the expenditure that we normally would have in the U.S. budget with these extra bills. That's quite an addition to our debt burden.
Yep.
Thanks.
Well, I mean, it's true, but the question is still going to be, is that the best we can do? I mean, this whole buffet is full of food I don't like. So you just kind of got to start with, there's no like really great choice out there. But the question is, what's going to help the most? If you look back to the Great Depression, Herbert Hoover was all kinds of conservative. He didn't want to spend any money. He wanted to close down trade doors. And, that's what we're going to keep all this economic activity at home. And all he did was drill the hole deeper. FDR came in, spent a lot of money we didn't have, made a little difference, but it wasn't until we hit World War II when we just started spending money because we had business to take care of and we couldn't be wasting a lot of time thinking about, gee, should we build another tank or not? And I think we're sort of in that kind of a moment where it's a difficult choice, but maybe it's what we have to do now to be sure we dig out of the hole. For me, again, the trick is, once we get out of the hole, we got to remember there's still a hole.
Yeah.
So people were asking about averages here, and while Mark, Andy, and Chris were talking, I went through and pulled up data. This is 2019 data. The average U.S. herd size in 2019 was 273 cows. So in Wisconsin, it was 165 cows. And since we have two commentators from Cornell, the average herd size in New York is 161. So what that tells us is that survey data that Mark is referencing actually trends to a little bit larger herds in Wisconsin. Another question rolled in here, and Mark, you maybe want to add some additional comments to it, but they were wondering, is there any different data by organic farms or any notable differences? In the survey, 90% of the farms were conventional, 9% were organic, and 11% were intensive grazing. Now, obviously, that rolls over 100%, but obviously, the other part here is if you're organic, you're probably grazing. So when you roll those two numbers out, you're only off 2%. But was there any takeaways on the organic front, Mark, that you can quickly grab?
This survey results have been tabulated and set out for us not long ago. I mean, really a couple of weeks ago. And one of the things that we still are in the process of doing is doing the cross tabulations, which is to say, let's take the responses that we have about people who identified themselves as organic, and let's cross tabulate those with other questions about things like, are you planning to buy more land? Or, what's the biggest problems you face? Is it regulations? Or, there could be lots of different things. The point is, we're not nearly done with the research on this data. There are several reasons to look at these kinds of questions, and it may differ and depend as to who you are. For the university's purpose, we want to know, just for the standpoint of helping us drive or think about research, what are some areas where there appear to be problems, issues, or even interesting questions that should be researched more, and also outreach. If we're trying to think about where is help needed, how can we get it out there? Now, I will also say that for folks, and I didn't cover all of these things, there was a set of questions that dealt with farm transfer and estate planning on here. Who's set up, who's prepared for that? There were questions about mental health. Because of the last 5 to 6 years, we've certainly seen more access to on the part of farms for, I'm seriously depressed. I really need some help getting through this. And we took a look at this, and it was actually about 10% of farms that said that they have accessed some form of mental help during this time period. So there are a lot of interesting questions on here, and they should be cross-tabulated with many of the responses on different things. So we will take a look at organic across a variety of these questions.
Let's do this one around the horn. And since Chris, you talked about this topic, we're going to start with you. If a farmer wants to do more analysis on their financial situation, what are the top, in your mind, the 2 or 3 metrics they should really dig into? And if Andy or Mark have some additional input after you give your top 2 or 3, I look at it this way, if I'm just getting started with this and I don't want to be overwhelmed, what should I look at?
Well, if you're just getting started, and you've got, pull your records together so that you have a balance sheet, beginning and ending balance sheet for the year, and an accrual adjusted income statement. And the accrual adjustments are important because the hay that's in the barn and the value of the silage and all that kind of stuff, prepaid expenses. If you have a good year again, we'll be prepaying expenses for tax purposes. Things like that are pretty important. So if you get a balance sheet and an accrual adjusted income statement, then you can start looking at profitability, solvency, and liquidity performance on the farm. So
your battle goes off pretty fast. Say them slower.
Sorry. You can look at profitability, solvency, and liquidity. Okay, so your rate of return on assets is a measure of profitability, your net farm income per cow. Liquidity is going to be working capital and current ratio, which is current assets minus current liabilities for working capital, and maybe working capital per cow. And for solvency, you're thinking of like debt to asset ratio, equity to asset ratio. They're the same thing because they add to 1. And then, certainly going forward, you can dig more down into the other members of the Sweet 16 ratio and think about the relevance to risk management decisions and things of that nature.
Mark or Andy, items to add in that?
Well, I think that, when we look at, beginning to do some benchmarks and things, that it's an interesting thing, first of all, to find out if you look different than your peers. And that's another thing I think that's important, is that if you're doing benchmarking, make sure that you're comparing yourself to your peers. So even though we try to provide scale neutral numbers by doing things like measuring net farm income over your assets, we do want to also make sure that, big farms and small farms aren't necessarily comparable, or shouldn't be, because you can't necessarily aspire, if you've got 50 cows, to being a 5,000 cow farm. You want to benchmark against farms that are reasonably of your size. And let's just say that you've discovered that your expenses were on the high side in comparison to your peers. With something like the categories that we have, the chart of accounts in the income statement, you can begin to drill down and look and see if there's any one or two things that really stand out to you. What should I focus on? And I would say that don't look at all of this and get overwhelmed. You know, you want to sit down with somebody that can help walk you through the process, think a little bit about it, and identify one or two goals to work on for the next year. Don't look at 20 goals. You know, you can't tackle that many things at once. Pick the big ones, pick some things that you can make progress at, and then think about looking at this and measuring it over time to see if you're making progress. That's what I would say, I guess.
Andy?
I'd like to pick up on two themes that Chris and Mark have mentioned and really highlight them. You know, you look at these reports, whether they're financial reports or the kind of reports, the herd reports, milking reports, and stuff that the animal scientists like to talk about. You can just drown in a sea of variables and get completely lost on, you know, what the heck is going on. And this was the point Mark was making. And I don't want to sound simplistic or insult anybody, but I think one of the key things is just to figure out, what are you trying to do? When I talk to students, they'll say, you know, how am I doing? And my first question is, I don't know, what are you trying to accomplish? Are you trying to get a job? You're trying to get straight A's? You're trying to be a great physicist? What is your personal goal and why you're here? And I think one of the key things for a business is, am I focusing on liquidity or am I focusing on profitability? I mean, solvency is kind of like you're dead or you're not dead, but liquidity and profitability, you've got a little more room to maneuver. And I think a lot of people get confused. These are like the same thing, and they're absolutely not. And they can go in opposite directions. And if you're managing for liquidity, you really cannot step back and say, oh gosh, I wish my net farm income was higher. And so that's a key thing. What is it you're managing for? And be sure that you pick the one that makes sense. The other thing that I think builds on something that Chris said, and I felt, is you have to play the long game. You can't get too hung up on what happened in 1 year. You have to be thinking about, what are my results over a period of time? Am I going in the direction I want to? The key thing that we've come up now and understanding, I think more so with the volatility we've seen, is you can play the long game, but you got to survive the bad year or the bad period. And so what does it take to survive? And that's where I keep coming back to concepts like working capital, which could also be in the form of inventory that you've got piled up for expensive feeds or something like that. But to me, it's knowing for sure what winning looks like, playing the long game, and making sure you can get through the bad year.
We're going to take a couple questions here, rapid fire, and I'm going to go ahead and tackle this first one, and if there's a counter opinion, we'll hear it. Are there any discussion happening at Washington, D.C., or with politicians to change the calculation of DMC payments as it relates to the producer payback price protection program and all those kind of things? I will simply say this, given the current political environment heading into November here, I don't see a lot getting done. And if something like that happens, it's probably going to be in the new year. Any counter opinions on that?
The sign-up period for next year will begin in October. Okay, so starting then, and I can't remember when the end of that time period is, but before the end of the year, people will need to make a decision about the level of coverage that they're wanting to have on the dairy margin coverage program, whether they would buy up or invest or not. One thing that I would say is that, and I seldom say things like this, but I'm going to anyway. This program is a good buy. It's relatively expensive insurance about margins for dairy farmers. And one thing I think we saw a lot of people concerned about last year was, I've had 5 tight years. We're forecasting 2020 to be a better year than 2019 was, and that ended up not too bad. So I don't think I'll spend any money on DMC. Well, important to remember, this is risk management. You know, you're not trying to forecast whether you've got a likelihood of a payment or not necessarily. It's, do you need protection? And if so, can you get adequate protection with a program like this at a reasonable cost? If you can, sign up for it.
Another question came in, if there's any new programs in play to take more dairy products for food banks. It has been announced that the Farmers to Families Food Box program will have more money allocated to it. But outside of that, I don't believe there's any new programs on the horizon. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's unspent funding, and of course there's ongoing programs. Food stamps is one I always think of that doesn't require some new thing because it's an ongoing program. We do need to pass some appropriation bills, which means the United States Congress has to agree on something. That seems to be pretty tough. But short of not passing appropriations, and usually they do a continuing resolution, which just means we're going to continue last year's budget. So there is still quite a bit of safety net in place. But yes, as I said in my opening remarks, the availability of additional funding is probably going to be really critical for the families that are suffering under the pandemic economy and really face some tough choices about whether or not they can, afford to live where they're at, or they're going to get evicted, whether or not they're going to buy food. So that challenge is pretty big.
This is just kind of a ballpark, your opinion. A good financial person who's listening to the program asks, how many producers truly have a good handle on their finances and financial knowledge? That's kind of a question in the wind almost, and I don't know if you guys want to take a stab at it with a percentage.
Well, Chris, that's farther in your court than it is in mine, but go ahead, you take the first stab.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it partly depends on what you define as having a good financial handle. And certainly I think there's I have a little bit of a bias in that I tend to work with the data, so I work with the guys that do. And it kind of depends on where you draw that line and what you call good. I mean, everybody has to deal with some of this for taxes, if for nothing else. And having said that, I would say, by the way, your Schedule F on your taxes is an exceptionally poor indicator of how you're doing for your farm income. So don't use that as your cost of production or as how you're doing financially for the farm income, because the way that you take the deductions and take the in particular the depreciation on new investments on that skews it. But I don't know if I'd want to hazard a guess there, but I do want to hear what Mark has to say.
Well, the correct answer, I think, Chris, is not enough.
We can live with that.
Yeah.
I will say, growing up, I always enjoyed heading to the accountant with my dad for the farm, because I learned a heck of a lot. And, you got your taxes prepared. Then the next step is looking at really what the farm is doing. And that's when I perked my ears up more. I just kind of sat in the background until we got to that, so I could be a better partner in the operation and a better editor. We're going to finish with this last question here. We got 2 minutes left in the program. And some of this Mark already alluded to. We have dairy margin coverage program. We have dairy revenue protection. And when it comes to risk management, I'm going to read the question exactly it was submitted. Most farms today know their cost of production, their break even, have goals in place for risk management tactics. But how can we navigate the negative impacts of PPDs, negative producer price differentials, through this farm bill? Even professional hedging groups are trying to navigate this, and it's murky. Now, a short thing here, a producer price differential would get rolled into your basis when you're trying to figure this all out. But it is a curveball here that you better have a big baseball glove. Mark, Andy, or Chris, anything to add on this one?
Well, I would certainly say you're precisely right when you talked about this, Corey, that these big negative PPDs that we've had are unusual. Although they certainly can and have happened, they fall into this category of what we would call basis risk. So we can protect class 3 prices pretty well. We can protect class 4 prices pretty well. We can use combinations of those two things to try to get to something that we expect will mimic our farm price, but there's always basis risk, and PPDs fall into that category. Normally, that's not very big. The last 2 months, they've been big. It's going to be smaller this month, and then I think pretty much go away and back to something closer to normal. But we have a different set of rules that we're engaging in now that can cause these large negative PPDs.
Corey, one thing I would just throw in, and this is a lot more Mark and Chris's turf than mine, but whether you're managing your risk on your own, particularly if we're talking about futures markets types of programs as opposed to DRP and DMC, if you're managing that on your own, or if you're getting a service, ask the question, who's doing the numbers? Are they taking this into account when they're trying to figure out how to correlate a class 3 and 4 futures price to an expected all milk price? I think the key thing to look at is what's the gap between the class 3 price and the class 4 price, and does that gap exceed $1.58? Because that's the 48 cents, $1.48, because that's the magic swing that gives you a negative PPD just by the basis that you got a huge gap between those two. And what's the difference between the class 3 price for a whole month versus the prior month, for the first half of the prior month? Because that's the other thing. That's about the difference between what's building the class 1 price and what's building the class 3 price. That's a lot more complicated than it used to be, but it's not that complicated, and you've got a lot of the data out there. And the question, if I'm talking to a guy that wants to do something for me, I'd ask him, are you looking at this stuff? Are you building this in? Which is really getting to Mark's point about, do you understand what the basis risk is?
Well, thank you, Andy. And that brings our hour to a close on Dairy Livestream. Our next webcast of Dairy Livestream will be September 23rd, 2020. And our program will be check-off, check-in. Early in the Dairy Livestream programs, we had Chad Vincent from Dairy Farmers in Wisconsin and Jal Talbert from the equivalent in California. This time around, we're going to have some state and national representatives on that program. So mark that in the calendars. And again, Corey Geiger here, your host of Dairy Livestream, and I'd like to thank Andy, Chris, and Mark for joining us. And most of all, thank you to the viewers today. We appreciate it, and have a great week. Bye-bye.